agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how you doing this morning?
Well, I think probably like half the country, I'm digging out.
Digging out, yeah, I know
digging
that.
out. But I'll tell you, I enjoyed the snow day. Actually, we had, I like to say that justice doesn't take a snow day. But in fact, yesterday it did, so that was nice.
Snow day. I have a friend who referred to what we had here in Cincinnati as Ice-crete, and I sort of definitely a lot of digging out involved, not that fluffy, fun sort of snow, but anyway. So, before we get started, I wanted to thank all the listeners who had the opportunity and the time to take our listener survey. We gleaned some, I think, valuable insights. We're going to be sort of digging through the data and the responses in the next week or two and kind of use that to give you ideally more of the stuff you want and less of the stuff you maybe aren't so crazy about. So thanks so much for taking the time to do that. Now, on today's show, we have a whole bunch of stuff lined up for you, like Russia and Ukraine. No war yet, at least as of right now, Saturday morning, but we'll see. Donald Trump, the Electoral Count Act, Mike Pence's response, and censure of Kissinger and Cheney, all that going on. Controversy over Ginni Thomas, that's Justice Clarence Thomas's wife, conservative firebrand, both of them, I guess, and the issue of judicial recusal. And in this week between the conference championships and the Super Bowl, an NFL-themed story, Brian Flores suing the NFL for racial discrimination, and we'll talk about that. And finally, the story that a lot of folks in the podcasting world and the world in general, I guess, are talking about, Joe Rogan and Spotify, and whether you want to choose Neil Young or Joe Rogan. I think Spotify made their choice. But anyway, we'll talk about that and more. But before we do that, before we get started, we'll take a quick break, and then we will kick things right off. All right, so we'll open today with the ongoing tensions between Russia and Ukraine, though I guess maybe tension seems too mild to kind of describe the brink of war sort of situation that currently exists. Now, on Tuesday, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin said, "We have not seen adequate consideration of our three key requirements concerning the prevention of NATO expansion, the refusal to deploy strike weapon systems near the Russian borders, as well as the return of the military infrastructure of the bloc in Europe to the state of 1997, going way back when the Russian NATO Founding Act was signed." He also said that NATO refers to the right of countries to choose freely, but you cannot strengthen someone's security at the expense of others. Now, President Biden this week authorized deployment of 3,000 U.S. troops to Poland, Germany, and Romania in a show of support, but a Pentagon spokesperson emphasized that these forces would not be fighting in Ukraine should Russia invade. Late this week, the Biden administration alleged that they have intelligence information that the Russians plan to film a fake attack by Ukrainian forces against the Russian troops massed at the border as sort of a pretext to invade Ukraine. But I should point out that the administration was either unwilling or unable to provide anything that publicly corroborates this claim. And while, at least 100,000 Russian troops remain massed on that country's border with Ukraine, and the U.S. has provided over 90 tons of military aid to Ukraine in the last few weeks, the White House has actually stepped back from statements made last week referring to a Russian invasion as imminent. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki told reporters, "We stopped using that word because I think it sent a message that we weren't intending to send, which was that we knew President Putin had made a decision." Now, there's a domestic politics aspect of this as well, Jay, but before we get to that, I wanted to get your take on what you make of this week's developments and whether or not you think a Russian invasion is more or less imminent, likely than it was a week or two ago.
I think it's still likely. And, this is a weird space for you and I to be in, right? Because there are a lot of things that we simply don't know. We don't have the intelligence reports that hopefully our governing officials have. We don't know sort of the situation on the ground. We don't know, what's happening beyond what we see or read in the news. That said, I think it's been plain for quite some time that Putin's ambition is to reunite what had been the former Soviet Union, and Ukraine is a big part of doing that. Now, he also, he might take a second prize type thing of if he can influence that government enough to essentially make it a satellite state without invading. Perhaps he'd do that. And right now, I think he's just having fun playing this game of what? Me invade? Which is why Jen Psaki sort of had to walk back the statements of, well, if it's an invasion's imminent and what, we're not invading. So, all in all, I have to say, unlike George W. Bush, I can't see into Vladimir Putin's soul. But I suspect it's not so good. And what he's looking for is some sort of control over Ukraine, whether that comes from a direct invasion or just from this sort of getting concessions by bullying, and get the actual invasion down the line. Right? There's no timeline that he necessarily needs to invade, and it looks as if we're not going to do anything to force the removal of troops. At least there hasn't been any sort of discussions along those lines yet. All in all, I am less upset with the Biden administration than I thought I would be at this point. Right? I think the administration, I think, is actually being stronger than what I anticipated. So I generally sort of kudos to that. I think our responses have been appropriate. We're realizing that, look, the United States is not going to go in and provide actual fighting forces in the Ukraine. What it can and should do and continue to do is make sure that we provide weapons so that Ukraine can defend itself, at least to the level that it raises the cost to Putin to invade.
Yeah, I was going to say, you suggest that Putin's having fun with this, what me invade sort of thing, but it almost seems that, at least some analysts would suggest, that this has actually made the sort of eastern border of the states, bordering on Russia, more inclined to side with the West because of this sort of bullying and saying, well, my gosh, we definitely need to be, can we get into NATO? And if we can't, can we have some sort of agreement or some sort of support? And so it could actually potentially run counter to what Putin wants, which sort of backs him more into a corner. Because if he wants control over Ukraine by one way or another, you could say where his actions are actually making it less likely that he would get control in any other way than through an actual invasion of that country. Yeah,
I think that's right.
Yeah, but you mentioned the domestic politics aspect of it, and I wanted to get on that because, on the domestic front, of course, there's been, I think, fairly solid support for the administration's response from congressional Democrats and plenty of opposition from congressional Republicans. And that's, pretty typical. But what's interesting to me about Republican opposition is that there's a split. The split between Republicans that believe that Biden isn't doing enough to deter Russian aggression and support Ukraine. And then there are those who feel that Biden's behaving too provocatively, too aggressively. And, there's that not enough camp. They're kind of the establishment Republicans, right? The RNC.
That would be me.
Oh, yeah, there you go. I mean, the RNC, they've really slammed Biden again and again for what they call his weakness in the face of this Russian hostility, though you seem to be a little less kind of slamming of Biden and saying, it seems pretty much reasonable, okay. So, but still, I
will say, without, I don't want to interrupt you, but no. I think I support generally the sense that we've got, right, the administration is going to take steps and is going to stand up against aggression to the extent that it can. What concerns me a little bit is the execution. Just like Afghanistan, right? Biden had said some boneheaded things in his press conference a couple of weeks ago, sort of implying that, minor incursions might be okay. And then the administration had to walk that back, saying, no, we didn't mean you can invade a little bit. And again, this thing's imminent, and I don't know how this is going to play out with this.
So the important
intelligence piece, but
the important point is that you want to make clear that you are not indicating any sort of support per se for Biden administration, given the fact that you would expect that at some point he's going to muck up the execution, even if you like the plan. Okay,
yes,
but you will reserve judgment on whether or not the execution is mucked up until there actually is execution, if that in fact happens.
Right. Well, I think I can say the minor incursion stuff was mucked up.
Which is, why presidents these days generally don't give press conferences and try to mediate all their communications through, people who are actually paid to do that sort of thing, like Jen Psaki. But anyway, but there's this other part, right? The Trumpist, the MAGA wing of the party, they feel just the opposite. And I think this charge is, I know this charge is really being led by Tucker Carlson of Fox News, who is unquestionably to me the single most influential voice in conservative media, for God help us. But Carlson has called Ukraine strategically.
That hurts, Mike.
Well, we'll put you at top 5, Jay. But Carlson has called Ukraine strategically irrelevant to the U.S. He's argued that U.S. support for Ukraine is about, in his words, hubris, stupidity, the damaged psychological makeup of our leaders, and massive lobbying campaigns by Ukrainian politicians and American defense contractors. And he's asked the question, why is it disloyal to side with Russia, but loyal to side with Ukraine? They're both foreign countries that don't care anything about the United States. And Carlson's not alone in this. There have been a bunch of conservative, influencers, voices, people, who have pretty significant audiences. In fact, last week, Donald Trump Jr. told Fox News' Sean Hannity that U.S. intelligence agencies might be lying in an attempt to instigate another war. So this is not insignificant, certainly. And I wanted to get your take on this, Jay, the MAGA wing, the Trumpist wing, and their views on this. Because, like I said, Tucker Carlson is the number one conservative voice in the media, and what he says is heard and believed by millions of Americans. So what's your take on that?
I think he's wrong and he's incorrect, and I guess the parallel that you would look at, and it's not a great parallel, right? I want to state that at the beginning, just because of some other things I'll probably say later on in the show. But the parallel is 1938, 1939. And there's very much this sense of, look, this is a European problem. What interest do we possibly have in defending Ukraine? And to some extent, I might agree with them a little bit. If you're looking at this as what is our particular strategic interest in Ukraine, and it's almost, and I'll make sort of the almost the Kissinger type argument. It's almost the same argument that we would have had in Korea or Vietnam. It's less about the country and more about the principle of standing up against aggression and containing foreign powers that want to be expansionist. Now, again, Putin isn't this. It's not obviously old school communism, containment, expansionism. But my concern is if we want to preserve or improve on or reclaim U.S. hegemony. We need to reassure other places, other allies, other countries that we won't. It's sort of if are we the world's policemen? I think yes, we are, and somebody's got to do it. And I think if we don't do it, then Vladimir Putin, or more likely the Chinese, do. So I think that's the national interest. It's not anything particular in Ukraine. But it's in the interest of having a international law and order, so to speak.
Yeah, and I totally agree, because we've talked about the linkages between, say, Afghanistan and Ukraine, and potentially in the future, Taiwan, where it certainly seems feasible to me that that Putin saw what Biden did in Afghanistan and said, you know what, this is a weak administration. They're not going to stand up. And so I feel more comfortable in potentially invading Ukraine. And if we let this go without a whole lot, then the Chinese look at that and think, well, Taiwan, what's the administration going to do there? And like you said, even if we don't want to be the world's policemen, as it were, well, the fact is that in a vacuum, someone's going to step into a power vacuum, and the question is do we want us to be in that vacuum, or do we want the Russians and or the Chinese to be occupying that position? And I think that's a pretty clear answer, given the fact that of those three governments, regardless of how some people on the left feel about the U.S. government, we sure as heck are a lot more democratic, and I think stand for far better ideals than the Chinese or the Russian governments.
Yeah.
So there you go. I think we're pretty much in complete agreement on that. And it's really so. What do you think, I guess, is motivating this Trumpist wing of the party? I mean, do you think that they honestly believe these things, or do you think that they're just this sort of a cynical political calculation?
I think there is, and there always has been an isolationist wing. I say in American politics, because they were sometimes the Republican Party, but I think they've shown up on the left as well, right? There was sort of a isolationist wing of, what are we doing supporting Israel? What are we doing in the Middle East? All that sort of thing. So I think it's always been there, and it makes sense, because there is a part of our country, part of our national ideology, part of our national identity is that we are separated from the rest of the world by two big oceans, and we necessarily have had to worry less about the problems of other continents. And we could in many cases say, hey, that's simply not our problem. But I think over and over, even when we've said those things, right, and even when the world was different, Mike, this is, one of my things that I'm kind of into, but, during the Adams administration, John Adams, there was what was called a pseudo war with France. And because France and England were at war because of Napoleon. And there was this sense that the United States can just stay out of this. Because look, these are countries that are at that time were far more far away than they are now. But really, we couldn't, and we ended up in the War of 1812 because of those same tensions. And I think those kind of things are perennial, right? We can't just say, and this, it came back 9/11. Much as we would like to think we can just live our own lives and everyone else will leave us alone, the rest of the world doesn't feel that way. And like I said, if someone's going to be that international policeman, or you will have international chaos. Either situation is not great. So.
And it's more important than ever because of things like globalization, global supply chains, and certain resources that are only available in particular parts of the world, at least in large quantities. And so we can't afford to basically just say, well, we'll just kind of retreat back within our borders and hope everything goes okay. I mean, China actually did that for a long time, and that much to their it was very negative for them for a long period of time. And so yeah. Absolutely. I think
But what I'm saying is I understand.
Oh, sure. The impulse,
that voice, right? And we heard that in World War I, and that why should we send American boys to fight and die over this really Byzantine conflict, involving the Germans and the French and the Serbs and the Austrians and all this sort of. So I understand it. So I don't think it comes from a place of we support Putin, that sort of thing. I do think it is just the old-fashioned American isolationism.
Well, that's so. You don't think there's any element of a cynical political calculation in it? That Tucker Carlson sincerely believes these things and that sort of thing. I'm just wondering.
Well, there's some on the right who, and they're serious people, who have said, listen, we should now or should have earlier probably would have been the better argument. In fact, look, the Obama administration sort of took this path at some point. We ought to have a good relationship with Russia to counterbalance China. That China is the much bigger threat or bigger competitor globally than Russia. So we are better off being in the Russian camp than out of it. I think that's an understandable view. I think it's mistaken because of the character of Vladimir Putin. I think if you had someone else running Russia, that might make sense from a geopolitical viewpoint. And look, sometimes you're allied with people that you'd rather not be allied with, but you don't get to choose the best situation. It's sort of just the least worst typically. So I understand that argument as well, right? That and it's the same. Look, it's the same argument that people in Europe and in England made, regarding Hitler. That, well, look, we don't like this guy. He sure looks like trouble, but he is a counterbalance against the Soviet Union. So, but again, I'm sort of thinking, taking that same historical lesson. Look where that got you.
Yeah.
So,
I guess for one thing, I would disagree to a certain extent with your characterization of the Obama foreign policy on that ground. But that's another issue. To your larger point, I absolutely agree with. And the reason why I'm picking on, sort of in a sense, Tucker Carlson is because here's a guy who I think is like a classic sort of Harold Hill, the Music Man, sort of con artist guy who 10, 15 years ago was a standard issue establishment Republican, and that wasn't working out for him. And so all of a sudden he recreated himself into this, or evolved into this sort of creature. And I guess I have a certain particular disgust for people like Tucker Carlson, and there are people like him on the left as well. And so they just sort of turn my stomach in a very special way. And that's why I may be calling out on Tucker Carlson. So, yeah, but... Okay, then. So I thought we are both globalists, internationalists, and I think for all the right reasons, Jay. And I kind of thought we would agree pretty strongly on that. So let's move on to something else. And we'll probably, we'll see how much we agree on. Before we get to Donald Trump, the Electoral Count Act, and acts of censure and all kinds of stuff like that, we will take a quick break, and we will be right back. This week, former President Donald Trump injected himself into the ongoing debate on reforming the Electoral Count Act. It's a Trump statement this week on DonaldJTrump.com. I read it every day, right? The website read, if the vice president had absolutely no right to change the presidential election results in the Senate, despite fraud and many other irregularities, how come the Democrats and rhino Republicans like wacky Susan Collins are desperately trying to pass legislation that will not allow the vice president to change the results of the election? Actually, what they're saying is that Mike Pence did have the right to change the outcome, and they now want to take that right away. Unfortunately, he didn't exercise that power. He could have overturned the election. Now, in another statement released a few days later, Trump argued that the House January 6th committee should investigate, in his words, why Nancy Pelosi did such a poor job of overseeing security and why Mike Pence did not send back the votes for recertification or approval, in that it has now been shown that he clearly had the right to do so. Exclamation point, but that's every Trump sentence kind of ends with one of those. Anyway, Jay, it's not often that we see a president call for an investigation of his vice president, throwing directly under the bus, and Pence responded to this, and Pence has done, I think, tried to stay out of direct conflict with his former president, but saying at the Federalist Society meeting on Friday, President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. He referred to January 6th as a dark day and said that the truth is that there's more at stake than our party or our political fortunes. If we lose faith in the Constitution, we won't just lose elections. We'll lose our country. So, Jay, well, what do you think, I guess, first about Donald Trump's argument about the Electoral Count Act, as well as Pence's response? And do you think that this makes it more likely that Congress will actually pass some legislation or do something to clarify the Electoral Count Act?
So Trump's description of how that plays out, I think, is just silly. It's very much circular logic, if you want to even call it logic. So I think he's wrong on all counts. We should get rid of the Electoral Count Act, regardless of whether it the point is it doesn't allow the vice president to pick the electors. Otherwise, that would be completely rewriting the Constitution. That's not how it works. Everybody votes, and then the vice president gets to pick. It's just ludicrous on its face. That act came up in the context of a weird contested election where you had contested slates from different states coming in at a different time, and again, I think that the intent was always that it's purely ceremonial, and I guess you could, but setting all that aside, there's nothing inconsistent with saying we ought to get rid of the Electoral Count Act because it breeds confusion, as opposed to we getting rid of it because it gives the vice president the right to determine a presidential election. Because look, either way, you can't do that by statute. You could not statutorily say, setting aside everything else in the Constitution, vice president gets to pick.
Yeah.
Likewise, if the vice president were somehow constitutionally empowered to choose electors, you couldn't statutorily take that power away from him.
Right. The 12th Amendment says the president of the Senate, and that's the vice president, shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, that's the electoral votes, and the votes shall then be counted. And that's it. The person having the largest number is president. And so there's that the vice president will pick and choose and decide which votes are legitimate, right? And so to me, really, if you want to be a constitutional conservative, and I think a lot of conservatives do, and I think we should all, pay attention to what the Constitution says, in a way, it's kind of a non-issue in the sense that if you look again to the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, right? Each state gets to choose a number of electors equal to the number of senators and representatives. So they get to decide how those electors for president are chosen, not the vice president. Not anyone else. In other words, this is a state function. There's nothing about any federal body determining the legitimacy of those electors from the state. And if you care about the 10th Amendment, which says the powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution or prohibited by the states are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people, well, for any kind of traditional conservative who believes in the constitutional text and believes in federalism would say, well, this is a state function. There shouldn't have been an Electoral Count Act in the first place.
Yeah. Now, keep in mind to me, if we want to dig into the history of the purpose of the Electoral Count Act was, well, what do you do if a state sends you two slates of electors? And in that case, it was, well, we defer to those state delegations to raise objections and so forth. Again, that was a weird anomaly that I don't think would ever happen again. So I think it's sort of a vestigial tale, and it was probably unconstitutional then, just as it is unconstitutional now. But it never really came into play. So those are my thoughts on that. On the one thing I would say is Trump is right that the January 6th committee should look at why there wasn't a greater presence or the Capitol wasn't more prepared for this. I think that's a reasonable argument. I don't think the committee should look into why Pence didn't reject the votes and just name Trump president. But
I think let me pull back and not quite defend Donald Trump, but his point, I think, if you want to find a point that maybe is worth some more discussion aside from the Capitol security thing is, well, let's say that the vice president believes and has what he feels to be credible information that there has been massive fraud at the state level. Well, is the vice president supposed to just sort of stand by and say, well, these are the votes I've gotten? And my answer to that would be, Well, yeah, because just because you might think something is the right thing to do doesn't necessarily mean that under our constitutional system you have the power to do that thing. And that's the same argument we make about the courts all the time, saying that, well, the court should rule this way because this is wrong. Well, but that's not the court's job. And if you allow anyone in our government to exceed their authority under the system to do the right thing, well, sometimes they're going to do the right thing when you don't think it's the right thing, and then the whole thing just basically breaks down.
Right. That was really well said.
Thank you. I think,
give credit where credit's due. A couple of weeks ago, I raised the hypothetical of well, what happens if we get to a close election, or it doesn't even really have to be that close, in 2024, and Vice President Kamala Harris says, well, I'm going to reject the votes of Texas and Georgia because of their racist voting laws. I don't think those electors were fairly elected and therefore should not be counted. That's the sort of mischief that can happen. Now, my expectation would be if that were to happen, that the mainstream media would hail her as a hero for civil rights. But that's a different question. Yeah,
I doubt that. There certainly would be some on the far left who might do that. But anyway, that's a different question. So, moving on to kind of a related sort of issue, I guess you could say, is that on January 6th, that is, Donald Trump recently told an audience at one of his rallies, this was in Texas, if I run and if I win, we will treat those people from January 6th fairly. We will treat them fairly. And if it requires pardons, we will give them pardons because they are being treated so unfairly. Then the next day...
So unfairly.
So, yeah, exclamation point. But the next day, then South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who's one, I'd say hot or cold on Trump, depending on how he felt the political winds were blowing, said that Trump's remarks were inappropriate and that pardons would inspire similar violence in the future, or could. And then when Trump was asked to comment on this by Newsmax, he said, I would absolutely, because some of them are being treated very unfairly, yeah, I would absolutely give them a pardon if things don't work out fairly. And of Graham, he said, Lindsey's a nice guy, but he's a rhino. Lindsey's wrong. It seems to me, or it's all some people, that the Republican National Committee might actually be siding with the former president here. On Friday, they voted to censure Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, two House Republicans on the January 6th committee, for, in the words of the censure resolution, participating in a Democrat-led persecution of ordinary citizens engaged in legitimate political discourse. And, this is the larger context here. Not only is Donald Trump the current front runner for the Republican presidential nomination in 2024, though granted, that's a long ways off. Ken seems to think he might be indicted or in jail or something by that time. And, maybe. But Donald Trump has also been a prodigious fundraiser since he's been out of office. This week, the Wall Street Journal reported that Donald Trump's $122 million in cash on hand, that equals the amount of cash on hand from the Democratic and Republican National Committees combined. So that's a whole lot there, and that's pretty unprecedented. So let me start with the pardon issue, Jay. What do you think about Donald Trump's position on pardons for January 6 people?
So first of all, I think presidents promising or implying that they might grant pardons is a big problem, and we should look at that very much as a very, very skeptically, right? That this is a president who might be indicating they might abuse their power. To the extent he's saying, look, people are treated unfairly or very, very unfairly, I suppose pardons might be necessary to some extent. My sense is there shouldn't be any kind of blanket pardons, right? I could see, say, for example, you have one of these people who walks into the Capitol, didn't hurt anybody, but it was trespassing and took some selfies. And gets convicted of domestic terrorism or something like that, sentenced to 20 years in prison. That would be being treated very, very unfairly. And I think in that kind of a situation, a pardon might be appropriate. one, you don't say so before you're president or even officially running for president. And secondly, I think pardons ought to be used to address specific big miscarriages of justice, not blanket get out of jail free cards for ideological compatriots. So, I mean, I think you can make an argument that, listen, if anyone is unfairly charged, unfairly convicted, wrongly convicted, a pardon can be appropriate.
And so
but it's got to be a fact-based determination and a case-by-case determination.
Yeah, and it seems that for everything we know, in fact, a lot of folks would say that the Justice Department has been erring, if erring is the right word, on the side of being more lenient than more severe, I guess in an attempt to be more likely to secure convictions. But also, I think, it sounds to me like you're saying that the appropriate response from a presidential candidate or even a president would be, well, I would always consider pardons in specific cases of injustice, but it would be inappropriate to comment on anything without having the facts of the case in front of me, which is not the sort of phrase that would ever come out of, Donald Trump's mouth, certainly. But there's another issue that he raised in that Newsmax interview. He made in the pardons thing. He made comparisons of January 6th to the Black Lives Matter protest in the summer of 2020. Donald Trump said, "Look, they tried to burn down. We're talking federal buildings. They were terrible. Every Democrat city was on fire. Well, okay, whatever, Trumpian hyperbole, and nobody says anything about it. Antifa and BLM are causing such problems, including death. They're not treating these people the same way." Now, I should point out that, of course, this was back when it was Donald Trump's Department of Justice, because these protests were the summer of 2020. And in fact, groups on the left at that time argued that the feds were actually overly aggressive in targeting protesters. There was this report that came out in 2021 from a group called Movement for Black Lives. They found that in something like 92.6 of the BLM protest federal cases, there were actually equivalent state-level charges that could have been brought against defendants, and among those, 88% of the federal criminal charges carried more severe potential sentences. And their argument was, well, the feds are just really going after these people for partisan political purposes, essentially led by, the Attorney General Barr at the time. And it's, I don't know what we can make of like arrest or conviction or whatever comparisons, but if we look at BLM, there are over 13,600 arrests nationwide related to those protests, according to the FBI. Around 1,429 cases against protesters or rioters, whatever you want to call them. A little over 1,000 of those were state cases, 367 were federal. If we compare that to the January 6th instance, 726 cases have been filed so far against those protesters or rioters. And those are all, I believe, federal cases because of where it happened. So that's just by the nature of that thing. So, I mean, what do you think about that comparison? I mean, my first take on that is it's always sort of difficult and dangerous and oftentimes not good to compare kind of the apples and oranges things, saying, well, they're both people who are doing kind of a similar thing. I always shy away from those sort of comparisons because I think they can very easily manipulate people into kind of believing things that aren't necessarily the case. But I want to get your take on that.
So I guess if I'm a politician, I think usually the safe bet is to say, I'm against riots across the board. That sounds right. Sure. I mean, to be the anti-riot candidate, I think is where you want to be. So, look, I think it's certainly fair to condemn the Black Lives Matter protests, riots, the Antifa involvement there, and those folks should be prosecuted, and I think hopefully are being prosecuted. The federal cases in those, of course, it's not a federal case if they're going down the street and they smash out some store windows. In most cases, I suppose you could probably make out some kind of federal case. But it is when you're trying to burn down a courthouse, as they do sort of every week in Portland, just because that's what they do. But so I think that makes sense why there are a different mix of state versus federal prosecutions. I think there's an argument also that the feds under Barr could have made that in many cases, state prosecutors were not taking up these cases. And we have this phenomenon across the country with some of these prosecutors, San Francisco, now New York, Chicago, where there is a reluctance to prosecute. So I can see there's an argument there. Well, the federal government needs to step in those situations. So I guess, is there a comparison? I think, well, sure, it's a comparison, but I guess my response would be riots are riots, and we ought to treat rioters, they ought to be prosecuted under the law based on what they did. And you take it from there, and the ideology behind the riot really shouldn't come into play.
If you put a rock through a window, it doesn't matter what reason you're doing it for. That's the same sort of crime and should be punished the same way.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
And if you try to burn down a federal courthouse, or if you kick in the doors of the Capitol. Again, that's the same sort of federal crime.
Yeah.
So
okay. Yeah, that seems reasonable. The last thing I want to talk about kind of on this general topic is I mentioned the Republican National Committee. They voted to censure Kinzinger and Cheney. Now, for Kinzinger, it's not a big deal because he's retiring, but Cheney plans to run for re-election. And so the censure means that they withdraw all the party's support, basically. Again, in the words of the censure resolution, at least part of it, right, for participating in a Democrat-led persecution of ordinary citizens engaged in legitimate political discourse. Now, that's only one part of the censure motion. There are a whole bunch of whereases and what have you. It's not that long, but one of the other whereases that sort of caught my eye, Jay, is they say, whereas the conference, that means the RNC, must design the strategy to stop the radical Biden agenda and retire Nancy Pelosi. Here's the part that caught my eye. Tasks which require that all Republicans pull in the same direction. And so, I read that, and I just read the motion in general, and I thought, so at what point does disagreeing with the party make you persona non grata officially in this case? And I wanted to get your take on the censure motion. And is this the fact that, Mitt Romney came out and said, this is not a good thing and people should be, able to freely express, conscience on these issues and not be drummed out of the party. So I wanted to get your take on this censure motion and what you take away from it.
So the whereas clause that you just read there, all pulling in the same direction. I would agree with that 100%, and for that very reason, would look at the RNC and say, "What the hell are you thinking?" That yes, the issue should be how do we get rid of Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, but rather than pushing that issue, the RNC is continuing to divide the party by relitigating Trump. January 6th and, the Trump delusions that he won. The other thing that strikes me as in the bigger sense, kind of political malpractice on this is, I think was Nancy Pelosi who said, January 6th is every day. And I think I said at one point that January 6th is the Democrats' favorite day now. And it is. So if you're a Republican, I'm talking about the purely Machiavellian strategy behind this, the last thing you want to do is keep bringing up January 6th. There's so much great stuff to run on here, right? I mean, inflation, the crime, general, Biden incompetency, all these things are great campaign issues for Republican candidates. But instead, the party's sort of getting bogged down in refighting this old war and going after its own people and, forming the circular firing squad. So I think it's just tremendously stupid. The reason I would say the reason they're doing it, I understand, is because the short-term gain is this is an easy way to raise some money.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the RNC fundraising proposals, they have Trump all over them because they know, especially for the small money donors. And in fact, that $122 million I mentioned that Trump has in cash on hand, the biggest portion of that was from smaller donations. And so, yeah, I think you're right. It definitely is you can understand it from a short-term perspective, but I do think that in the end, even though, I mean, at this point, still, I believe the last polling data I've seen suggests that a majority of Republicans believe that the election was stolen. There are certainly tens of millions of Americans, if not more, that believe that. If you're trying to build a winning national coalition, a stable winning national coalition, this is not really, it seems to me, the way to do that sort of thing.
Yeah. Now the gambit here, right, is that, look, you can do this and get all the money and then pivot to wherever you need to be later on. And maybe that works, but my sense is why invite a bunch of primaries for candidates where you spend more money than you need to, right? There's more Republican money getting spent on both sides that, again, if everyone's pulling in the right direction, same direction, can be better spent against the Democrats.
My sense of things.
As Sinead O'Connor said, fight the real enemy, right?
My sense of things is that I'll actually be a little optimistic on the GOP and Trump, which I'm usually not, right? But in thinking about this, it seems to me that it's quite possible that the Republican Party, as sort of an institution, a collection of individuals, is not necessarily as Trumpist as a lot of people seem to think. I think it's just very, well, like political parties, successful political parties are, very strategic, very Machiavellian in the sense of, well, if Donald Trump is going to bring in money, invoking his name and going to give us some wins, we'll use that to the extent we can. And I think what we're likely to see is if Trump-supported candidates do not do all that well in the midterms, if they don't do very well in the primaries, I think we're going to see some of that support start to fade away, basically. Donald Trump will be the leader of the Republican Party as long as he is useful to Republicans who want power. And as soon as that's not the case, now, that being said, there certainly are some people who are true believers, and there's a small number of them, and there have been attempts to kind of put them more into decision-making roles in the party. But I still would like to believe or would hope that those folks are in the minority and that the sort of political realists, political pragmatists are still sort of in most of the positions of power.
Yeah. So the other, if you want to do the really deep think and, multidimensional kind of chess, is there could be a thought in the RNC that, as you said, Kinzinger is retiring, and is Cheney really going to get beaten in Wyoming? My sense would be no. Is she really likely to lose a primary, or I don't think so. So maybe they could say, look, this is the safe bet. We'll show our Trump bona fides here, raise some money, and at the end of the day, it'll be sort of a no harm done. I think that's one way. Again, if you're playing the kind of Machiavellian game, which is what they do, right? That's their job. That I could see that. Now, I disagree with the analysis because I think every time you do this, or at least with the analysis of, well, we're going to censure these people. I think if you want to raise money off Donald Trump, okay, that makes sense. But you can probably do that without trashing other people, other candidates, and violating what Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment. So.
You should tell people what that is.
I disagree with, strategically, yeah.
And the 11th commandment, that's thou shalt not speak ill of fellow Republicans, correct? I seem to recall that.
Exactly.
There you go, yeah. And I think that's important because it sets that precedent, right, where there are these purity tests for being in the party. And then, I think that definitely is long-term very destructive for short-term games that in the end aren't worth it. So we I think, are very much in agreement on that. Now, with that, we come to the end of the free ad-supported segment of the show, and we have a whole bunch more we're going to be discussing on the full-length episode. And if you would like to get that and you're not a Patreon supporter, well, you can become one by going to patreon.com/ Politics Guys. But if you are not in a position to support the show, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you set up with access to the full episodes. And if you'd rather not support us on Patreon, well, you can do that through Venmo or at Politics Guys, as well as on PayPal. All of our support links are in the show notes and at politicsguys.com/support. And whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate the show on whatever podcast app you listen to, and leave a review, and also share episodes on social media. That really helps us out a lot. Thanks so much.